recognized symbol of excellence in sports entertainment.
Wrestling fans, and thank you for tuning in to a very special edition of Gotmark76 this week. I will be paying tribute to the 30-year anniversary of one of my favorite all-time NWA Pay-Per-View events, the Great American Bash 1989, The Glory Days. I have come up with several matches here to try and mimic the pay-per-view as best I could. Of course, I can't do a tuxedo match. I can't do a War Games match. I can't do a 2-ring battle royal. However, I felt I could do some matches and pay some tribute to one of my all-time favorite events in the history of wrestling. The time frame was 1989. Ted Turner had purchased the NWA in November of '88, and the NWA was going through some transition. One of my favorite times during this period was the 89 to early 1990, when guys like Sting and the Great Muta and Lex Luger were really given their opportunity to shine, when such stars as Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, and Dusty Rhodes had left for New York or the World Wrestling Federation. So during these matches, I will not be so much calling the holds and the maneuvers. I will, however, go over some of my favorite memories from that match. Maybe talk about where the angles went from here or some other things. Just a general conversation during the course of the match. Without further ado, let's start with our opening match as Flying Brian Pillman takes on Wild Bill Irwin. So we are going to start out with Flying Brian Pillman taking on Wild Bill Irwin. Flying Brian had just debuted here in the NWA, and in the weeks leading up to this event, he was all over the syndicated shows of NWA Worldwide. He wrestled occasionally on Saturday night. Had some video packages made. Of course, if you read the After magazines like we did in the 80s, you knew that he was from Stampede. So we had heard the name, but not really seen him in action. A lot was touted of Flying Brian Pillman when he made his way into the NWA because he was a high flyer, and they weren't really going with that direction. I mean, if you look back to 87, 88, early 89, they didn't really have guys who flew that much. You had guys like Bobby Eaton who were aerial, but they didn't really have guys who could move around like Flying Brian or the Great Muta. Those guys were just a breath of fresh air to this promotion, and part of the young Lions really rising up. And looking back in 2019, it's easy to see all the mistakes that were made by Jim Herd and the NWA board at that time. But they did do some things right, and Brian Pillman definitely became a household name. And of course, he's in the ring with a veteran Wild Bill Irwin, who at this time, I mean, he still has several years left in the business. He had made a name for himself in the AWA, world class. And of course, teamed with his brother Scott to form the Long Riders. Which kid grew up in the 80s and didn't have the AWA figures? You needed to have the Long Riders, because if you bought the Road Warriors, you needed the guys to go against them. So this contest was one of the first matches after the 2-ring Battle Royal, which of course we can't do on WWE 2K19, but that 2-ring Battle Royal was won by the Skyscrapers. One was won by Sid Vicious, the other Dan Spivey, and of course Peanut Head, Theodore R. Long, took the winner's purse to $50,000 and took the crown for himself. So what a way to get over a heel manager by having his men do all of his work. It was just a great stuff like that. Just made this time very fun to watch. If you listen to Jim Cornette's podcasts and various YouTube videos, he was on the booking team when Flying Brian was trying to get a push, and he tells a great story about how the Midnight Express had set up Brian Pillman to just really become a huge single star. Ric Flair wanted to wrestle with Pillman. He had a good rapport with all the major names. And again, Jim Herd kind of dropped the ball. Or maybe Brian Pillman could have been a bigger deal than what he ended up being, which was still a very, very good, respectable career. So Baltimore, of course, in 1989, a very hot crowd. If you go back and watch on the WWE Network, they do a pretty good job of capturing the feeling. You know, Ric Flair had gotten pile driven on the table, which again in 1989 was something you didn't really see all that much, by Terry Funk. And he had taken some time off. Now, you know, we have the luxury of knowing why Flair took some time off around that time, 1989, May to be exact. But at the time, we were thinking, this guy's hurt, he's going to retire. You know, God, I think in 89, Flair was early 40s. I mean, you know, you didn't know how long he was going to wrestle for. So when he came back against Terry Funk at the Great American Bash, it was his first match in a few months. You could just see that the crowd exploded for Flair when he came back, and he became a huge babyface. So I remember, and Pillman here going for the cover. I don't think he's going to get him here, and he doesn't. I remember right around that time, I mean, you have to remember, in January, Steamboat came in. Steamboat won the world title. And he lost it to Flair. Now, Flair had his rematch at the Clash of Champions in April. He had his rematch again at Wrestle War. I was kind of wondering why Steamboat never got a rematch from Wrestle War. But they, of course, went in the direction of Terry Funk, and the rest, they say, is history. The Flying Brian would go on, you know, again, this was his first pay-per-view match. I believe he made his debut in the NWA around June, maybe May. Didn't make the Wrestle War 89 pay-per-view. But by the end of the year, he was a top contender to the U.S. title. He wrestled Lex Luger at Halloween Havoc 89, almost won the U.S. title. I think wrestled him again at the Clash of Champions New York Knockout. As Pillman's perched high, I think this might be it if he hits it. That crossbody off the top rope. Now, during the actual pay-per-view, Brian hit that from the opposite ring. Remember, there were two rings next to each other, and Pillman leapt from the second ring and nailed Irwin and got the pinfall victory. I tried to mimic that the best I could here. But your winner in the opening round, or the opening match, Flying Brian Pillman. So again, Brian Pillman would go on to have great success. He was a top contender to the U.S. title in the early part of 1990, teamed up with the Z-Man, who made his debut in September of that year. And they won the U.S. Tag Team titles. And Flying Brian just went on to become a household name in the NWA and WCW. And this was his first pay-per-view match. So, Flying Brian, your winner here. We will be back with more tribute to the Great American Bash glory days after this quick timeout. And the following contests here on our tribute to the Great American Bash 89 glory days will be the dynamic dudes of Shane Douglas and Johnny Ace taking on the Skyscrapers. of Big Sid Vicious and Dangerous Dan Spivey. So the NWA had Douglas and Johnny Ace start teaming up around April or May. They made their pay-per-view debut at Wrestle War, the pay-per-view prior. And of course, we knew Johnny Ace as the flag bearer for the Sheep Herders, and he was also Road Warrior Animal's brother, but they never really mentioned that on TV. If they had to push some tag team, I'm glad they at least tried to get these guys over. Although I still will, for the life of me, never understand why they didn't get more out of the Midnight Express, but that's just my opinion. So a lot of people, I remember when they first started doing the Dynamic Dudes gimmick. I remember Shane Douglas from the late days of the UWF, 87 era. He had a small run in Crockett Promotions. I remember Johnny Ace being the flag bearer for the Sheep Herders. And then, of course, they just put these guys together. So, not really explaining anything. And, of course, you have these two men. So, Dan Spivey, of course, in the World Wrestling Federation, we had known him. He had spent maybe 85 through late 87 in the World Wrestling Federation. And Sid Vicious, we only knew through the After magazines. He was wrestling in Memphis under a mask as Lord Humongous. So, again, right around this time, May, June of 89, this influx of young talent that included Flying Brian Pillman, Shane Douglas returning, Sid Vicious, they came in, and of course the Skyscrapers became one of my favorite tag teams of 1989. And if you go back and watch this match on the WWE Network, you'll see the fans in Baltimore absolutely went nuts for Sid Vicious. They saw, and trust me, Sid was green. You can see where Vicious missed some cues, maybe didn't perform certain moves the way it should have been done. But you could tell that the fans really wanted to push this guy as the next big star. And he would go on to have a respectable WCW career. He became a member of the Horsemen in mid-1990. The weekend of, I believe, Capital Combat 90. And the Skyscrapers, they would go on to feud in 1989 with the Steiner brothers and, of course, the Road Warriors. It was Halloween Havoc in 89. My hometown of Philadelphia, where I was there, witnessed live. And I just remember Sid Vicious standing over Road Warrior Animal, and you're talking like a 7-inch difference. I mean, I don't know legitimately, but just the looks, it was, at that time, nobody towered over the Road Warriors. And these two guys did. As Dan Spivey misses an elbow drop on, again, I tried. I had some fun doing these matches. They're unedited, so Dan Spivey missing an elbow drop. But Dan Spivey was one guy that I thought every time they tried to, they meaning WCW, tried to push Dan Spivey, something would happen, whether it was an injury to him or an injury to Sid. Of course, the Skyscrapers were originally Sid and Spivey. When Sid had that, I believe he had a punctured lung, they brought Mean Mark Callis, who of course was The Undertaker. They brought him in to team up with Dan Spivey to continue that feud with the Road Warriors. And it was at Wrestle War in February of 90 when Spivey didn't show up. It was Mark Callis and I don't know who was under a mask as one of the Skyscrapers, but it all fell apart. So then that was in February of 90. You went through and followed the rest of the year, and by Starrcade 90, Dan Spivey kind of came back into the picture. Stan Hansen had debuted during the summer of 90 or the fall of 90. Beat Lex Luger for the U.S. title at Halloween Havoc, and Dan Spivey was at ringside for that match. And Dan Spivey, they made a mention that him and Stan Hansen were partners over in Japan. And Spivey ends up teaming with Sid, and the crowd went nuts. This is 1990, and keep in mind, Sid and Spivey were both heels. Sid was a member of the Horsemen at the time. So the crowd really wanted to cheer these guys, and I just chalked that up to another booking mistake by the NWA. But you needed a team to go against the Road Warriors. And like I said earlier, these guys were taller and I don't want to say they're more muscular, but they were bigger than the Road Warriors. But Sid Vicious, of course, my favorite memory of Sid was 1990 Halloween Havoc, when he appeared to have won the NWA World title from Sting, pinned him in a quite curious fashion, and of course we found out later that Barry Windham had impersonated Sting, cut his hair to a spike and all, faded face paint, same ring tights, and Sid Vicious we thought was going to win the world title, but that was not the case, as him and Dan Spivey hit that devastating double power bomb maneuver, and you can kiss this one goodbye. And that's pretty much how it happened. I don't remember if they pinned Douglas or Ace, but the double power bomb put somebody away on the Dynamic Dudes at Great American Bash 89. So an influx of tag teams, even though my favorite tag team of all time, the Midnight Express, was kind of in mid-card status. They were really trying to get over new tag teams. I give them credit for that. I think there's a way that you can do that by having the Midnight Express or teams like that put over the talent. But here's that double powerbomb maneuver, and of course both men would use this as a finishing maneuver in their singles career as well. So in the history books, the following contest was the tuxedo match between Jim Cornette and Paulie Dangerously. We cannot, of course, mimic that match here, so the following contest will be a Texas Tornado match between the Varsity Club, Mike Rotundo and Kevin Sullivan, and Rick and Scott Steiner. We'll be right back after this quick timeout. So here we are with our following contest. The Varsity Club of Kevin Sullivan, the Games Master, and of course Captain Mike Rotunda. They will be taking on the Rick and Scott, the Steiner brothers. Now, a quick backstory here with the Varsity Club. The Varsity Club has some changes in '89. Of course, Captain Mike and Dr. Death Steve Williams from Oklahoma had won the NWA World Tag Team Championship. And then after a controversial match at Wrestle War in May, the NWA had a tournament to crown new champions. And somehow between May and June, Dr. Death had been kicked out of the Varsity Club. Dan Spivey was a member of the Varsity Club for a short time. Former U.S. Tag Team Champion with Kevin Sullivan. But of course he became a member of the Skyscrapers. So some revamping going on in the tag team scene. And of course this was Scott Steiner's wrestling pay-per-view debut. Scott Steiner had been accompanying Eddie Gilbert and Rick Steiner at ringside, of course, in this main match on in history. Missy Hyatt was in the corner of the Steiner brothers. You can't have a manager at ringside during Texas Tornado matches on the WWE 2K platform. So I tried to get the uniforms for these men as close as possible. The orange of Rotundo just couldn't show up, or didn't show up as well, so it's not really quite as close to the orange I was looking for. But this match would be the first time that Rick and Scott teamed up on pay-per-view, and of course that would be the first of many. They would go on to become one of the best tag teams in the history of the business, and we all knew Rick Steiner was good. There's urban legends of Dusty Rhodes wanting Rick Steiner to beat Ric Flair for the NWA World title at Starrcade 88, and Ricky Steamboat did not enter the NWA until later actually in early part of 89. And Scott Steiner was making a name for himself in the CWF and the AWA. Smaller promotions, of course, came to the mainstream, the NWA, in the spring of 89. And by year's end, they would go on to win the World Tag Team Championships by defeating the Freebirds. Now, this was interesting for the Varsity Club as well. You know, The Games Master Kevin Sullivan, he wrestled. He was, again, a former U.S. Tag Team Champion with Dan Spivey. But he was more or less the manager of the Varsity Club. He didn't wrestle as much, was mostly the manager. And at the conclusion of this match, you kind of saw Sullivan take a back seat. He would go on to be a host or co-host of the syndicated programs, WCW Saturday Night 605 with Jim Ross. And Mike Rotundo, he would still stay a singles star. He would wrestle at Halloween Havoc against the debuting Z-Man. He would wrestle Dr. Death Steve Williams. And of course, he went on to his most memorable run, I'm kidding of course, as Captain Mike Rotundo the Sailor, the Fisherman. And Norman the Lunatic had something to do with that. It's a whole mess in 1990. So you could say that this match was something of the end of the Varsity Club as well. And of course, Mike Rotundo would go on to most famously, I believe, be known as IRS, which, sure, why not? I will always remember him as Captain Mike Rotundo, but I digress. Of course, it was around this time, the summer of '89, when Robin Green made her presence felt every time the Steiners wrestled in singles or tag team action. Now, again, she was the real-life wife of Kevin Sullivan. They, of course, did not tell us that. But if you followed wrestling and you saw the after magazines, again, like I had, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, The Wrestler, Inside Wrestling, you knew that this woman was at least associated with Kevin Sullivan through all the pictures of Kevin Sullivan in the early 80s in Florida. So you kind of knew the face, but you didn't really know what was going on. And as a 12-year-old kid, I remember saying, she looks familiar from those magazines, but I didn't know that they were married, of course, in real life. And the woman would, of course, go on to manage Doom against the Steiner brothers. Doom would debut at Halloween Havoc '89 in Philadelphia. Wearing masks, they were, of course, the Natural Butch Reed and the All-American Ron Simmons. And later on in '89, actually early part of '90, when the Horsemen kicked Sting out of the group, woman became somewhat of a manager / valet to the Horsemen for the better part of that run. So this match was a Texas Tornado match. As Rick Steiner does not get the pinfall there. Rick Steiner, of course, defeated Mike Rotundo for the NWA World Television title at Starrcade. Rotundo won the TV title back from Rick Steiner at the Chi-Town Rumble in February of '89. And there was the move that became such... Oh my gosh, I remember talking with my friends about that move. Nobody had ever really seen it before. The Frankensteiner, the Hurricane Rana. I remember, I think it was an episode of the Louisville Slugger with Jim Cornette when he interviewed the Steiner brothers. I think it was during the Clash of the Champions. It was either Fall Brawl or New York Knockout. Don't remember which one. But Rick Steiner called it the Frankensteiner, and from that moment on, that's what it was called. Just one of the most fun moves to watch live. I'll never forget in 1992 when Scott Steiner had come back from his injury, his arm injury from '91. The WCW had a house show in the Civic Center in Philadelphia. It was the Steiner Brothers versus Big Van Vader and Mr. Hughes. And I believe this is going to be the pinfall, and there it was. And I'll never forget Scott Steiner doing a Frankensteiner to both Mr. Hughes and Big Van Vader. The crowd in Philly went hot that night. So, of course, the Steiners would have a bright future ahead of them, winning the World Tag Team Championship later that year. They would defeat the Midnight Express in August of 1990 for the U.S. Tag Team Championship, and of course, they would just be a staple in WCW until leaving in 1992. The Varsity Club was really no more after this, except for a brief run in, I think, 99 or 2000, but by that time, unfortunately, Rotundo and Steiner were both past their prime. So don't go away, we have much more tribute to the Great American Bash after this quick timeout.
The great Muta and the Stinger. And we'll have the Stinger's introduction upcoming.
And ladies and gentlemen, his opponent, hailing from Venice Beach, California. He weighs 252 pounds. He is the World Television Champion, accompanied to the ring by Hotstuff Eddie Gilbert. The champion is Sting.
As this crowd rises to their feet in this one, the television championship of the world will be on the line here. The Stinger with one of the most impressive one-loss records in the NWA history. But he's going against a man that has never been beaten, has never been pinned since he arrived in the NWA. Oh, it's the irresistible force and the immovable object in this one.
Well, I tell you, we've seen Sting defend that championship a number of times, come home a winner. But he's never been tested like he's going to be tested right now by the great Muta.
Just having a little fun there with the introductions by Gary Michael Capetta, Jim Ross, and Bob Caudle, of course. And this match here, one of my favorite matches on the card. Again, Great Muta came in I think, March of '89. And Sting, of course, had made a name for himself thanks to his Clash of the Champions 1 match against Nature Boy Ric Flair. And when these two men clashed, we really didn't know what direction they were going to go in. A lot of us, I think, were thinking that Sting was going to take that next step towards a U.S. or world title match. Meanwhile, Great Muta was doing maneuvers and just his body language was just so different. And it was really a welcome change to a 12-year-old kid watching at home. I really thought that all of his flips and dives, and it was just so fluid and so good. I really became a huge fan of Muta when we weren't supposed to. I mean, he was a heel and he would do dastardly tactics, and he still would get big pops from the fans because they loved him so much. Now this match, of course, the Great Muta was undefeated at the time, and Sting had just won the TV title from Mike Rotundo, I believe, in April. So it wasn't a very long title reign for Sting, but they had already begun to plant seeds of doubt heading into this match. as you heard Bob Cottle say in the introduction, Sting will never has been tested like he has here against the Great Muta. And of course, we all know how this pay-per-view ended. And if you don't, please watch. I mean, I've never seen a better end to a big show than the end of the Great American Bash 89. Having a little fun there. Again, I can't mimic the match. And as we get closer to the end of the contest, you'll see that I had to make do as well. Now, in the early days of the Great Muta, he was brought in by Gary Hart and, of course, Hiro Matsuda. A lot of people have a tendency of forgetting that there was a very short time there where a super heel group was going to be formed. I believe it was the Yamaguchi Corporation, where it was going to be Michael Hayes, Ric Flair, Kendall and Barry Windham, Butch Reed, and I think the Great Muta were going to be part of this whole big, what became J-Tex Corporation is what this corporation was intended to be. And part of me, maybe in an alternative universe, I would like to see where that would have come to fruition. Maybe you would have had Barry Windham defeat Ricky Steamboat for the world title, then cause dissension amongst Flair and Windham, and you could still have Flair with this huge babyface run, but instead of Terry Funk, you insert Barry Windham. I don't know, it's kind of interesting to think what could have been, but of course Barry Windham broke his hand at the February pay-per-view, Chi-Town Rumble against Lex Luger, took some time off and then just left. Went to the World Wrestling Federation. And then you have guys like Sting, who in 1988, Sting almost got a pinfall there. In 1988, you had Sting make a huge household name for himself, thanks in part to Ric Flair in that 45-minute Classic game, Clash of the Champions 1. The NWA went with Luger and Flair, the Great American Bash, so you had these two young lions in Sting and Lex Luger that you could just see were being groomed for great things. And at the time, we're talking 88, 89 NWA, I thought it was best to have a heel champion. Make those babyface contenders important, so if or when they won the title, it would mean that much more. And they really did a good job with Lex Luger at 88. They really did a good job with Sting in the latter part of 89. But I, as a fan of Sting, and Sting was one of the few faces that I cheered for. I always went to these cards in Philadelphia with my dad and my cousin, and I always cheered for the bad guys. The Midnight Express were an exception, the Road Warriors were an exception, and Sting was an exception. So when they were faces, I cheered for all those guys. Sting was really the only babyface that I actually liked. And I met him at WrestleMania weekend this past year at Access, and I let him know. I said, hey man, I was a big fan of Jim Crockett Promotions, and you were the only babyface I ever cheered for. And he kind of laughed, and I'm sure he didn't really care what I had to say, but hey, the fact is that I got to meet him and thank him for all that. But Sting, in this time, you kind of thought, okay, well, he was a contender to a world championship. Now he's a TV champion. And the TV champion, of course, was an important title back in the day, but it was definitely and here we go. I'm switching something up. The TV championship was important back in the day, but it was a step down from the world title. So we didn't really know where Sting was going. And as 89 drew to a close, and he ended up teaming with Nature Boy Ric Flair and going against J-Tex Corporation, which of course was the fantastic ending in the real life ending of this event. Set that up. Sting joined the Horsemen. And Sting was a member of the Four Horsemen with the returning Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, and Ric Flair. And we all kind of saw where that was headed, and Sting kind of made a name for himself by falling for the old trick several times in his career. He was fooled by Flair a couple times. Once here in 89 or early 90, then the other time, of course, in 95 at Halloween Havoc. Sting can't trust those horsemen now. And of course, this match ends in controversy in real life. Of course, I could not mimic that in the game. And at the conclusion of this match, in history, the NWA World Television title is declared vacant, and a series of matches between Sting and Muta takes place, with the Great Muta getting the best of Sting. So Great Muta having a World Television title run in the mid to late part of '89. As Sting has that Scorpion Deathlock locked in on Great Muta. So one of my all-time favorite moments in the history of the business. In the last few minutes, again, I recommend anybody watching to go and watch this on the network. Just a great match, a great event from top to bottom. But the conclusion of the main event, and Bob Caudle and Jim Ross are trying to close the show. They're, Sting and Muta and Flair and Funk are all battling each other in the backstage area. And Ric Flair says, and I'll never forget, he goes, "I haven't said thank you in 10 years, but thank you, pal." And it was just really cool, that I look at that, and if you see the conclusion of the Ric Flair-Terry Funk match, you'll see people leaving the arena, I'm sure, to beat traffic. But can you imagine in 1989, Ric Flair and Sting teaming up? That just, I would have been so mad if I was at that show and left and didn't get to see that bit of history. But I always thought the Great Muta was cool. Again, he always did flips, he did the moonsault, and he was doing that stuff in World Class Championship Wrestling. You can go back and watch on the network World Class Championship Wrestling from 1988 as the White Ninja, the Black Ninja, Super Ninja, something like. He was a ninja. Sting has the inside cradle, and I think this is how I'm going to end it. Of course, in the real match, it was a belly-to-back suplex. Sting had Muta. Sting clearly had his shoulder up before Muta, but the referee, of course, declares Sting the winner. There's controversy, blah, blah, blah. We all been there before. We know it. But the fact is that it planted a seed that the Great Muta was indeed a player in the NWA. And of course, he would show up later on that evening at the conclusion of the Ric Flair and Terry Funk match and begin the feud really that held the rest of the year between J-Tex Corporation and Sting and Ric Flair. So I'm going to go with your winner, Sting. That's how it happened in the record books, even though they say it was controversy. And your winner and still TV champion, at least for now, till about July or August when they held up the NWA TV title. Your winner here was Sting, even though Great Muta would leave with the belt. Great Muta grabbed the TV title, went through the crowd. And there's your winner and still NWA World TV Champion Sting. I wish I could do a brawl at the end, but I cannot. But you would not have seen the last of Sting if you were watching this pay-per-view live as it happened. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat challenges Lex Luger for the U.S. title in a no disqualification match, or does he? Stick around. We'll be right back after this quick timeout. And welcome back to the Gotmark76 30-year anniversary tribute to the Great American Bash 89. The following contest was supposed to be a no disqualification match for the U.S. heavyweight title between Ricky Steamboat challenging Lex Luger. Prior to this match, in a backstage interview with Gordon Soley, Lex Luger said he would not defend the title in a no DQ match. So, Lex Luger being the heel personified in the NWA. One of my favorite times of Lex Luger as a heel was when he turned his back, and that's why this match came to happen. It was back at June's Clash of the Champions, Guts and Glory, when Ricky Steamboat was going up against Terry Funk in a top contenders match. And at the conclusion of the match, Lex Luger came out to help a downed Ricky Steamboat. And in the weeks prior, well, I guess we can go back there in a little bit, but Luger basically turned his back on Ricky Steamboat, nailing him with a clothesline and proceeding to attack Ricky Steamboat. And Lex Luger, of course, went into the Clash of the Champions with a little bit of an attitude. He had lost the U.S. title to Michael P.S. Hayes at Wrestle War. And within a couple weeks after that, he actually regained the title back. But in the meantime, he was complaining about not getting world title opportunities and not being the #1 contender to the world title as he was the U.S. heavyweight champion, thinking he earned that right. But Lex Luger didn't remember the storyline, which was that at Starrcade 88 in December, at the Norfolk Sculpt, that Lex Luger was not allowed another world title match with Ric Flair as world champion. So I remember a 12-year-old kid saying, wait, why is Lex Luger complaining about not getting a title match because Ric Flair's a champion? He should have done this when Steamboat was a champion. And I think a lot of fans back in 1989 probably would have cheered Luger over Steamboat. I mean, that's kind of the way that the business was going, you know, the big, strong, muscular guys. And let's be honest, Steamboat is one hell of a wrestler, but he didn't always have that charisma that maybe a Sting or a Luger or somebody had. So I always found it odd that Luger waited until Flair was champion again to turn his back on Steamboat and turn heel. He should have just turned heel when Steamboat was champ. But this heel turn of Lex Luger in June of '89 all the way through basically February of '90 was my favorite time to be a Lex Luger fan. He took that heel persona so well. I mean, he was arrogant, he was cocky, and he backed it up. You know, a lot of today's heels in the business, they will act cowardly, and then at the first sign of them getting in trouble, they back out of the ring and beg for mercy and this and that. And Luger was more like, hey, I'm arrogant, I'm better than you, and I'm going to show you. So I love those kind of heels where you're just arrogant, cocky, and you back it up. And Flair was the same way. Flair would do some chicken moves every once in a while, but his career wasn't defined by being a coward. And Luger definitely wasn't a coward during this heel turn either. And of course, at the time, watching this as it happened, I really thought this was the beginning of a big feud between these two. I mean, this was set up as a no disqualification match. Luger heeled out and said, I'm not wrestling him in a no DQ match. So then Steamboat, wanting to get his hands on Luger for the revenge at the Clash of the Champions, said, I'll take him any way I can get him. So I thought this was the beginning of the feud. It turns out that Steamboat was going to leave the NWA shortly after. And if you watched the match on the network, I remember the contest after this was the War Games, and they were setting up the steel cage double ring War Games match. And Jim Ross even said, I think that Steamboat has a beef with the NWA. I think he should get another rematch, this, that, the other thing. And I thought we were going to see a house show loop of Lex Luger defending against Steamboat. That never happened. So this was their one and only match in '89. Or at least their one and only televised match. They may have wrestled in house shows. And I can understand that maybe Steamboat, after losing the world title, didn't want to be the U.S. heavyweight champion. Maybe that's seen as a step down. But I definitely think that he would have gotten Lex Luger to where Luger needed to be to again challenge for the world title. So Steamboat shortly leaves after this match takes place. And Luger then goes on to defend the U.S. title against Wildfire Tommy Rich, Flying Brian Pillman, and found himself in an interesting position in November of '89. Of course, we mentioned earlier during the Sting match that Sting teams up with Ric Flair for the rest of the year. They start here in July, the Great American Bash, and for the rest of the year, Sting and Flair are nearly inseparable. They're involved in the JTEX Corporation feud. And during the November Clash of the Champions New York Knockout, Ric Flair is presented with a Wrestler of the Decade award, and Sting is presented with a Most Popular Wrestler of the Year award, and Lex Luger demolishes both trophies. At the conclusion of the I Quit match, after Terry Funk insists on shaking Ric Flair's hands, Gary Hart turns his back on Terry Funk. And as Funk goes to go after Hart, Great Muta and Dragon Master come out, and it's a beatdown. And then you have Flair saving Funk, you have Sting coming out, and then Luger comes out to attack Sting and Flair. So they really had an opportunity to have Luger versus Flair world title matches. And I'm sure they could have eliminated that storyline from the Starrcade before, saying that Flair insists on getting his hands on Luger. But we kind of got ripped off of a Sting-Luger feud. And I think, obviously, they had some matches. I think they even had a TV match for the U.S. title. It aired on Saturday night one night. But they didn't really have the long-running feud that I think we all wanted to see Luger versus Sting. And of course, in hindsight, maybe it was a good idea because Sting was just getting into his own as a single star and as a mega star himself. And Luger was really good, but he definitely needed someone like a Steamboat or a Flair to be in the ring with to really showcase his power skills. So maybe having the two power men at that time in 1989 wasn't the best move to go with. Lex Luger found himself feuding again with Brian Pillman in a couple good matches. Halloween Havoc 89, the New York Knockout Clash against Pillman. And Luger found himself with a new top contender at the end of 1989, and he was going to face Steve Dr. Death Williams at Wrestle War. So they were grooming that Clash 10, that Corpus Christi, Texas Clash, Texas Shootout. When Sting got hurt, they were really setting up Dr. Death to challenge Luger for the U.S. title. So that Sting injury not only derailed his NWA World title run until the following July, but may have also stopped Dr. Death Steve Williams' opportunity at being U.S. Heavyweight Champion. So this match kind of gets crazy. I'm trying to do the best I can with a 2K19 video game to duplicate what happens, but again, it was supposed to be a no disqualification match. And in the actual Great American Bash 89 match, Luger brings in the chair, and they do some crazy hope spots where you just thought the false finishes were going to happen and Steamboat was going to win the U.S. title. They did a shot where Luger had the chair in his hand, Steamboat took Luger down by his legs and slingshot him into the ring post. And the steel chair hit Luger square in the head. And I remember watching it and saying, wow, Steamboat just needs to go for that flying crossbody. We're going to have a new champion. But instead, Steamboat grabbed the chair, went after Luger. The referee, Tommy Young, tried to get it away from Steamboat. Steamboat grabs the chair with Tommy Young holding the chair, swings Tommy Young out of the ring, and proceeds to hit Luger with the title. Or with the chair, with the chair. Getting disqualified. And of course, we thought, again, that this was going to be a series of matches, and Steamboat just went and left. Steamboat, of course, would come back in 1991 Ironically, after Lex Luger had won the world title at that year's Great American Bash event, Steamboat will come back in November of 91 with Lex Luger as the World Heavyweight Champion, although I don't recall them ever squaring off for the world title. And here is my way of ending this contest the way that it happened in the record books. And of course, Steamboat chases Luger all the way back up to the locker room, swinging wildly with the chair, almost hitting the fans. It was 1989. It was a fun time to be a fan. And there you have it. Your winner by disqualification, the total package, Lex Luger. The following contest is War Games, and I cannot duplicate that, so we will go right to the main event. The next match will be Terry Funk with a special surprise, challenging Nature Boy Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight title. Don't go away. We'll be right back into this quick timeout. So the main event here in the Gotmark76 tribute to the Great American Bash 89 is for the World Heavyweight title, as Terry Funk will challenge Ric Flair. Now on the graphic you can see here that Gary Hart is in the corner of Terry Funk. That was actually a surprise. Gary Hart, of course, the manager of the great Muta. This was a surprise by Terry Funk to bring out Gary Hart, and of course we now know why. At the conclusion of the match, of course, a big angle takes place. I will get into that shortly. But a brief history on why Funk is challenging Ric Flair. During Ric Flair's feud with Ricky Steamboat, several of their matches had judges, just in case the match ended in a draw. And the judges were to decide the winner of the match. This happened on April 2nd at the Clash of the Champions. It happened again at Wrestle War when Ric Flair defeated Ricky Steamboat for the world title. As Ric Flair was celebrating and being interviewed by Jim Ross after winning the NWA World title again, Terry Funk came in the ring to congratulate Flair and then issue kind of a soft challenge. Flair, obviously very tired from the match he had with Steamboat, made a comment that Funk needed to go back to Hollywood, or he wasn't ready to wrestle Ric Flair after being in Hollywood for so long. And Funk kind of took offense to that and went ahead and attacked Flair. And then, of course, in 1989, it wasn't really common to see somebody pile drive another man on the table, but Ric Flair did that, or Terry Funk did that to Ric Flair. So Ric Flair took some time away from Wrestle War 89 until this night, July 23rd, 89. Flair didn't wrestle. He just took some time away from the business. When he came back, of course, this was a hot feud. So Ric Flair immediately comes back and is the face. He is the good guy. He's the, fans were cheering Flair all the time. His arrogance, his cockiness, his attitude, the way that he backed up, saying that he was the best. Many times I attended wrestling shows in Philadelphia, and Ric Flair would be cheered more than anybody else. So Ric Flair, even though he was quote-unquote a bad guy, always got cheered. He came here, he was a legitimate babyface. So this match, of course, he's not acting like a babyface. In this contest against Terry Funk, it's an all-out brawl. And they start the match on the outside, and they go to work with each other. They do all kinds of maneuvers. Both men are busted open, which I felt was ironic. A year prior, the Great American Bash 1988, Lex Luger had Ric Flair submitted in a torture rack. But because Lex Luger had a cut on his forehead, the Maryland State Athletic Commission suspended the match and gave the match to Ric Flair. So 1 year later, they're in Baltimore again. Different circumstances, different wrestlers. Ric Flair versus Terry Funk. Ric Flair gets busted open, and I'm like, okay, great, here we go. Maryland Athletic. Oh, they're nowhere to be found. So maybe that was the difference between Jim Crockett Promotions and the Jim Herd run WCW. But that angle, I guess, had made its mark and wasn't very popular in 88. I'm sure they weren't going to do it again in 89. But I remember as a 12-year-old wrestling fan wondering why the match was still continuing when the previous year Lex Luger was forced to lose the match because he was bleeding. But of course, we will get into the major happenings at the conclusion of this match. Gary Hart is at ringside. He is the manager, as we know, of the Great Muta. So Ric Flair pins Terry Funk in this contest. Spoiler alert. And as Ric Flair chops Gary Hart, the Great Muta comes out to attack Flair for chopping Gary Hart. And it's a 3-on-1 attack as Ric Flair is beaten down by Terry Funk, Gary Hart, and the Great Muta. Even Doug Dillinger gets a karate kick to the back at the hands of the Great Muta. They get mist flies, chairs are being used, everything's going on. The fans immediately start chanting for Sting. They want Sting to come out and rescue Ric Flair. And Sting does not disappoint. Sting comes out, saves Ric Flair, and these 4 men, 5 if you include Gary Hart, spend the next 10 minutes or so going all over the Baltimore arena, attacking each other, beating each other up. It was one of the wildest endings to a major show I recall seeing, when you had Jim Ross and Bob Caudle trying to end the pay-per-view telecast. Now, back in the 80s, these things went on at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was a Sunday night, I believe, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're trying to end the show, and Ric Flair, Sting, Great Muta, and Terry Funk are battling with chairs and branding irons all over the place. It was just a wild scene. And of course, one of my favorite Ric Flair promos, he grabs a microphone, Jim Ross's microphone, I believe, and says, "I haven't said thank you in 10 years, but Sting, thank you, pal." And I just remember that was the beginning of this really awkward relationship. I mean, again, I'm 12 years old, I'm a fan, I'm watching this, I'm thinking, Sting can't trust Flair. Like, I know this. Why doesn't Sting? Well, sure enough, for the rest of the year, Sting and Flair took on all members of the J-Tex Corporation, and that J-Tex Corporation would mostly be Funk and Muta. And as the year progressed, Dick Slater became involved, as he was involved in the match at Clash of the Champions. That was the night of the big angle where the NWA was fined because Terry Funk brought a plastic bag and tried to choke out Flair. And of course, Pillman performed CPR on Flair, and just a blur of what was real and what was staged, what was a work, what was a shoot. Of course, Dragon Master Kendo Nagasaki was Dragon Master. He came in. Buzz Sawyer came in, and that was the later group of J-Tex after Funk had already lost the I Quit match to Ric Flair at the November Clash of the Champions. So Flair was out, or Funk was out, and Muta, Sawyer, and Dragon Master kind of took over the J-Tex name. And that went through the February Clash, the Texas Shootout, when earlier in the evening, Sting was kicked out of the Four Horsemen. So instead of being Flair, Arn, and Sting taking on Muta, Dragon Master, and Buzz Sawyer, it was only Arn and Flair. And if you go back and watch that event on the WWE Network, you'll see just how much the fans wanted to cheer for the Great Muta, and what a possible missed opportunity there, because the Great Muta was a very popular wrestler, and he was ending his run in the NWA. He was going to go back to Japan. But I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Luger stayed a heel and Muta took Sting's spot for the world title match at Wrestle War. That would have been a pretty interesting time. So here's Funk going for that spinning toe hold. That's how he won the world title in the 70s. And again, I had to play this match trying to get I tried to do things the way that they ended, and there's that inside cradle. which was how it ended at the Clash of Champions, at the Great American Bash, excuse me, where Funk was going for that step over toe hold and Flair took it into an inside cradle. Actually, if memory serves correct, Flair was going for the figure four. Funk turned it into an inside cradle, then Flair reversed it. One of those two things happened, but there's Flair going after Gary Hart. And just a great match. This was a fantastic brawl between these two men. Of course, many fans go back to their I Quit match, which was the end of their feud. But I tell you, that as awesome as that match was, and let's be honest, that really should have been Starrcade. That I Quit match between Flair and Funk should have happened at Starrcade in December, just a month after it did in November. And they instead did the Iron Man and Iron Team tournament, which I just thought was crazy and nuts and just a wasted opportunity. I think if that I Quit match happened at Starrcade, everything would have made much more sense. You still could have had Arn Anderson come out, congratulate Flair. Still had Sting as a member of the Horsemen. Because, gosh, Sting was teaming with Flair for 6 months against J-Tex. So all those things still could have happened, I think, but I was not part of the NWA Board of Directors. I was not a member of the booking team. I was not Ted Turner. So Funk basically retired. Well, Funk never retired, let's be honest. But Funk, quote-unquote, retired after this contest, and he was a play-by-play guy with Jim Ross on several shows, pay-per-views, syndicated shows, and you could just tell he had the itch. It wasn't sitting well with Funk that he was on the sidelines. He definitely wanted to be part of that action. And I believe this is where I ended it. An inside cradle, Flair will secure the victory. And again, I cannot show you and cannot duplicate a wild brawl all throughout the arena. But please, check out the WWE Network, Great American Bash 89. Granted, some theme songs aren't in there. Gary Michael Capetta had to be cut out for some of the announcements, but please, go back and watch the last 10 minutes of this match and the final several minutes of the pay-per-view broadcast. One of the most memorable I remember. I mean, one of my favorites of all time, and one of the most memorable of all time. And that's about going to do it here for the Gotmark76 tribute to the Great American Bash 1989, the Glory Days. One of my favorite all-time events in the history of wrestling. I thank you very much for spending some time listening to me rant about these matches. And we will see you next time with a regularly scheduled Gotmark76 this week. Until then, we'll see you at the matches. Goodbye, everybody. What the what?